Anindya is also a professor of information systems in the Information Operations and Management Sciences Department, and he's also a professor in Stern's Marketing Department. As well, Anindya is an NEC Faculty Fellow and the director of Stern's Center for Business Analytics. Anindya's research analyzes the economic consequences of the internet on industries and markets transformed by shared technology infrastructure. He's worked on expanding understanding of reputation and rating systems, digital marketing, sponsored search advertising, wearable technologies, mobile commerce, mobile advertising, crowdfunding, and online markets. He's consulted for a number of Fortune 500 firms. He's given more than 200 talks internationally, and he's a frequent keynote speaker in executive gatherings and thought leader events globally. His research has received numerous awards and grants, and he was recently named by Business Week as one of the top 40 professors under 40 worldwide, and by Analytic Week as one of the top 200 thought leaders in big data and business analytics. So please join me in welcoming Anindya to lunch.
Good morning. So it looks like from all the social media pictures, you guys are having a fantastic lunch. Well, first of all, thank you to Elizabeth for the introduction. It's very kind. The only sad thing about the introduction is I'm no longer under 40. Okay. So I'd like to talk to you about what I think is one of the most fascinating instruments of financial inclusion today, and that's crowdfunding. Right? So what's crowdfunding? Crowdfunding is essentially tapping into the wealth and the wisdom of the crowds. Okay. So just so I get some context, how many of us in the room have heard of crowdfunding? Awesome. How many of us in the room have participated in any campaign on a crowdfunding platform? Okay, very nice. Okay, cool. So crowdfunding is, we are at a point in time where crowdfunding has evolved a lot from what it used to be before. So what I thought I'll do today is give you some idea and some sense of where we are heading in this space, right? So I'm going to paint using a broad brush, what we've seen so far, what's happening today, and what is likely to happen in the next few years. And a lot of that is also likely to impact some of us in the room, the careers you choose, and so on. So I'll try and give you some sense for that. Okay, so crowdfunding is, like I said, is basically, and as like most of you know, it's a collective effort where a pool of people come together to raise money for a given cause, right? Now, who uses crowdfunding? For off late, we have seen a lot of entrepreneurs use crowdfunding platforms, right? Before if I had to raise money, I'd try and raise money from friends and family. I might go to an angel. I might go to a VC. But for various reasons, that hasn't really taken off, right? So what's happened off late is we've basically resorted to the internet. We've essentially used the internet as a means to raise money. But that's not how it started. Right? So if I take you back about 7 or 8 years, crowdfunding actually started because crowdfunding was all about artists. Okay? So those of you who've participated in any platform, any campaigns on crowdfunding on Kickstarter or Indigogo, you know that a lot of the initial projects in these platforms were all about movies, music, books, artists, fashion, and so on. Right? But a number of new regulations have been put in place by the government in the US, which has taken this way forward than what was anticipated. When we first, and this is something that's very close to my heart, I worked with Indigogo for the last 5 years, mining all of their data sets. I also work with OneWest, which is one of the largest equity crowdfunding platforms in the US. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, all of it. So how did it all start, right? So let's go back about 7 or 8 years, right? So 2007, the beginning of the stock market crash. 2008, the market really tanked. Real estate markets tanked. So at that point in time, if you were an entrepreneur, right, and you wanted to raise money, right, and you go to a VC or an angel and say, here's my idea, right, 99.9% of the time, you'd be just turned down. So, which is very different from what we call Startup 1.0, the first dot-com boom in 1999, 2000, right? At that time, if you walk into a VC's room with an idea and a set of PowerPoint slides, that's all you needed, right? You would come out with a check. Small, medium, large, depends on the idea, okay? But in 2008, if you had an idea and you went to any one of these traditional lenders, there is no way you would get anything out of it. Today and since then, the number of metrics used by venture capitalists or even angels to even consider giving you some sort of a check is non-trivial. Okay? You will need 100,000 visitors per month to come to your website as a starting point, and it takes years to sort of build to that, right? So a few visionaries started thinking about what if we could bypass the venture capitalists and the angels? What if we sort of tap into the wisdom and the wealth of the crowds? How do we do that? Well, we have the internet, right? So the founders of these platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo, put their heads together and said, why don't we use the internet to raise funds? Okay? So by 2009, 2010, we had Indiegogo and we had Kickstarter and a few other platforms in place, and there was a lot of action in this space, right? So all the major newspapers took up the headlines. There was a lot of attention given to this, and so on. At this point, it was still all about a very specific kind of crowdfunding, which is the one that I mentioned before, crowdfunding for primarily artistic causes, books, movies, and so on and so forth. Okay? So let me give you some examples of what we've seen beyond the arts, right? So in the US, especially in the larger cities like New York and San Francisco, cycling accidents are a major cause for concern. So last year, for example, in these cities, we had close to 5,000 very serious and fatal cycling accidents, and over 65,000 less fatal accidents, right? So these two brothers in San Francisco, Kent and Adam, said, what if we try and figure out a way in which LED bulbs would be mounted on bikes, on cycles, and this way, when the ambient temperature drops and the light drops, these LED lights would lit up on their own, and incoming traffic could see the cyclist from a distance, and this would alleviate the issue of cycling accidents. So they wanted to raise $43,000. They ended up raising 5 times that amount, $215,000 from about 1,500 people. Okay? And this is one example. Another example is in video games, right? So there's a very well-known company called Double Fine Adventure who decided that the adventure genre of video games. How many of you are video game players? Okay, so you guys know, right? So the adventure genre of video game players was considered risky and niche. So these guys said, why don't we resort to crowdfunding? They put up a campaign on Kickstarter, and they wanted to raise about $400,000. They ended up raising $2 million. Okay? And the story goes that they raised $400,000 within 9 hours of the campaign. Within 24 hours, they raised $1 million. Okay? And this went on. This is only a snapshot in time. Okay? So this is, again, a very different example, but gives you a sense for the power of crowdfunding. And then there's a potato salad story, right? You guys know about that?
A lot of people are talking about this. There's this guy in Ohio who's making news after he raised more than $35,000 on Kickstarter so that he could make a potato salad. Isn't it? 35,000 bucks for a potato salad, or as Whole Foods put it, that sounds about right. Yeah.
So there is wisdom, but there's also madness. Okay, but jokes aside, this screen gives you a sense for some of the most powerful and successful initiatives in crowdfunding. If you use the wearable tech, you probably heard of the Pebble smartwatch. They raised $10 million using crowdfunding. If you know of the Dash, they raised $3.5 million. One of the first 3D printers, Form 1, they raised about $3 million. So the list goes on and on. Canary, if you actually use the subway trains in New York City, you'll often see the ads of Canary, which is a security app, home security app. They raised a couple of $1 million on crowdfunding campaigns as well. Perhaps the most fascinating of all is the story of Oculus Rift. Okay? So what was Oculus? So if you are into video games and stuff like that, you probably heard of this story. So Palmer Luckey was a teenage video game player, and he started looking around for these virtual reality headsets. And it turns out that there was not a single device or a gadget in the market that really appealed to him or that was satisfactory. So he said, why don't I just set up my own venture? I'm going to start hiring people who are going to produce the world's best virtual reality headset. So he ended up with a campaign on Kickstarter. He wanted $250,000. It turns out that he was able to raise $2.5 million, okay, from 10,000 backers on Kickstarter. But that's not the end of it, right? A couple of years down the line, does anybody know which company bought out Oculus Rift? Facebook, for $2 billion, right? Now, this is one of the most talked about success stories on Kickstarter, but it also comes, it's a double-edged sword. See, what happened with this story is when Facebook bought over Oculus for $2 billion, right, who got all the money? That guy over there, right? None of those 10,000 backers got a single penny out of it because this was a reward-based platform. This was not an equity crowdfunding platform, okay? So even though this is talked about as a very great, nice story for Kickstarter, it actually put Kickstarter between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, they wanted to talk about this. On the other hand, it really upset their entire backer community. So talking about the reasons, why do people donate to crowdfunding platforms? Again, some of you, if you donated to these platforms, you've seen early game releases and small perks as being one reason. Identifying with the social cause, a very common, popular reason. In my research, I've seen a lot of evidence of altruism, where people actually want to donate, not because they're getting something out of it, at least nothing tangible, but just the satisfaction of it. And perhaps, last but not the least, perhaps the most interesting one of this is equity crowdfunding. Okay? So I'm going to talk a little more about equity crowdfunding in a second. How big is this market? It is big. Last year, we raised collectively in the US close to $9.5 billion. And the growth rates have been very compelling. Okay? So in the US alone, we had about 145% growth rate year to year last year. And the rough breakdown is, you got about $300 million from equity, you got about $1.5 billion from reward, another $1.5 billion from donation, about $5 billion from peer-to-peer lending, and real estate. So one of the most fascinating aspects of crowdfunding is, we have seen, is in real estate crowdfunding. So people can come together and buy out, Donald Trump's building. Well, I don't want to buy that one out, but you get the idea. So you can actually buy out an entire building by coming together in real estate platforms. Globally, also, it's picking up. We saw last year about twice the amount being raised globally. And it's actually used in very different ways across the world. But the core idea is very similar. So China, South Korea, India, some of the European countries, we've seen a lot of action there. So this is steadily growing. In terms of the actual divisions, again, you've got the taxonomy goes the following way. Certain platforms, you get a reward out of it. Certain platforms, you donate. There are also an example that is really interesting is what companies are doing internally. So companies like IBM have their own internal enterprise crowdfunding platforms, where employees can actually pitch in with an idea, and other employees who like the idea can start pulling in, donating some dough to that idea. Okay, so let's talk about equity, right? So this is, like I said, one of the most fascinating instruments of financial inclusion for a number of reasons. Okay? So with the Oculus Rift Kickstarter story, like I said, none of those 10,000 backers got a single penny out of the $2 billion because this was not an equity crowdfunding platform. What an equity crowdfunding platform does is that when you pitch in with an idea, let's say you're the investor and the rest of your friends are your backers, each of your friends who backs your idea or a project actually gets a piece of equity in your company. Okay? So this is almost akin to like an IPO, except that it's in a much smaller scale. Okay? So in the last 15 years, about the only time when I've seen the Republicans and Democrats agree on something is in the context of equity crowdfunding. Okay? So by 2012, after the recession had started alleviating, all the senators and politicians realized that they need to do something about job creation. Okay? So there was a number of different acts passed by the Senate. This is, again, like perhaps the only instance that I have seen where politicians could come together and work together to promote a specific cause. And this resulted in the creation of what's called the Jobs Act. Okay? Jobs is an acronym for Jumpstart Your Own Business Startup. So what does Jobs Act do? So in the US today, we have about 8.5 million accredited investors. Okay? The definition of an accredited investor is anybody who has assets worth $1 million or more, excluding your house. Anybody who's earning individually $200,000 or with a joint income of $300,000 with your spouse, that's an accredited investor. We have 8.5 million accredited investors, but only 3% of them actually put in money in startups, okay? Which means that they cannot alone be the sole driver of jobs. So what the Jobs Act did is, or is in the process of doing, is this lowers the bar and redefines who an accredited investor is, okay? So today, if you're making between $100,000 and $200,000, you would be an accredited investor, and you'd be able to spend about 10% of your income per year in a startup. Okay? So a couple of new regulations, Title II, Title III, and Title IV in crowdfunding are massive game changers. Okay? So one of the biggest problems or biggest limitations of the previous set of rules was that you might be an entrepreneur and you might have a flourishing startup, but legally you are not allowed to raise funds using social media. So you are not allowed to use Facebook or Twitter to actually solicit funding. Okay? Title II actually got rid of that limitation. So in today's world with Title II, you are allowed legally and legitimately to raise funds. Okay? And this is a big deal because we've often seen the power of social media is massive, right? To be able to raise the kind of funds to promote a certain cause, there are very few instruments that are better than social media. So that was one game changer. Another game changer that came about is the extent to which you can raise money, or the amount of money that you can raise. Okay? The first limitation was you could only raise $1 million on crowdfunding. Okay? But pretty soon, what we have seen is because of Title IV, that limitation is also being now in the process of being removed. And by October of 2015, if these SEC laws actually take place as promised, we see that with Title IV, startups would be able to raise $50 million from crowdfunding platforms. Okay? Equity crowdfunding platforms, of course, but that's a huge jump from the previous limitation. So why am I giving you these details is some of you, if you have ideas or plans for entrepreneurial or as a potential investor, this is something to think about. We have seen platforms like Circle Up and Crowdcube, et cetera, emerging. OneVest is another such platform. And as these rules are put in place, things are going to be a lot of interesting and promising alternatives are going to come about. Okay, so that said, right, not everything is hunky-dory yet. There's some very important questions that many of you actually have to think about. So one is, this is the current picture of the different states in the US where these exemptions have been passed. So the green states are the one where it's enacted. The yellow ones are where it's in progress. The white ones haven't started it. There's only 2 states where they've rejected it, but chances are they'll have to come back and revisit that. Okay? So what are some issues here? The first issue is, think about this, right? So when you're investing in an IPO, right, you get a lot of details about the company, right? There's a big fat brochure, like hundreds of pages, and you go through it. What the SEC is mulling over now is what kind of disclosures are they going to require of entrepreneurs? Okay? And at what level of granularity is that disclosure going to be? Because at the end of the day, the one thing that you don't want is fraud, okay? Or even a bubble. So what are these disclosures going to be like? At what level of granularity? What information would we require of investors as well? Okay? So fraud can be multiple types. We don't have to, we don't have to limit ourselves to fraud only from entrepreneurs. There can be investor fraud as well. Another thing is, what kind of due diligence should we ask of the entrepreneurs or the startups, right? So one of the things that Arun talked about was trust in the sharing economy, right? It's very relevant even in the context of this kind, perhaps more so than others, because you're talking about non-trivial amounts of investment, right? So how do I know that when John Doe goes ahead with a startup and pitches it on Circle Up, that I can really trust and rely on him? Okay? Are we going to resort to some reputation signaling markets like we've done before with Amazon and eBay? Or are we going to require some very, very different kind of reputation signals? Okay? That question is still up in the air. What about investor rights, right? So if you are an investor in an equity crowdfunding platform with a campaign, Do you get the same rights as you would go if you were to invest in a regular company through an IPO? Are you going to have different classes of voting rights, different classes of voters, and so on and so forth? Okay? Can these stocks be traded? So lots of questions are out there that need to be addressed. But the hope is that with Title IV being passed by the end of next month or by the end of October, you're likely to see a lot of these issues being addressed as well. This is the reason why it's taken the SEC about 3 years to pass these laws, because not all these questions have obvious answers, right? Okay, so just to summarize and wrap up, why am I really excited about this? Not just because I spent 5 years doing research or 4 years working with companies in this space, but because I've seen the numbers, and I truly, really believe that this is a massive, massive, enormous potential phenomena. Okay, so the current size of the venture capital market in the US is about $25–30 billion, right? If the math and the data that we have seen works out the way which I really foresee it will work out, this is going to increase from 30 billion to 300 billion because of equity crowdfunding platform. Okay? And the good thing is the SEC is cognizant and aware of all the issues here. So they are taking their time, but we will see a lot of these laws put in place. Okay? So like I said at the beginning, this seems to me is one of the most brightest forms of financial inclusion. Yesterday, Ajay Banga talked about the haves and the have-nots. Today, if you look at the VC and the angel capital world, right, we are talking about the top 0.1% of the society. With equity crowdfunding and the new definition of accredited investors, you are opening up the pool of investors well beyond the top 0.1%. We're talking about the top 10 to 15%. Okay? All right, so many of you, like I said, are very likely to play a role in this space, either from the investor side or the entrepreneur side. And even if you are in big businesses that are not related to startups, I don't have time to talk about that, but there's an ecosystem that's being formed where big businesses will also play an active role in this equity crowdfunding platforms. Okay? So that's all I had to say. Again, you can find me on the Stern website or on Twitter or on LinkedIn anytime. Thank you.